Alrighty, so hello and thank you for joining me for Mindful Monday. I'm Daphne. Each Monday, I offer a guided meditation and often a talk to go with it. If you are catching this as a replay and you'd like to join our Mindful Monday meditation live on Zoom, you can just look for the link below to get signed up. We'd love to have you. And now on to today's talk and practice. So a question I have for you is, have you ever avoided doing something in your own life because you were afraid or because it made you feel anxious? And if so, you'll want to listen to all of today's talk and join us for the practice because we're going to address how to take action despite our fears and why it is important for us to do that. So sometimes we think that fear is a valid reason to not do something, like avoiding things that might make us feel anxious because we're afraid that we might not be able to handle it well. Some common ones that I hear from people that I work with, some of my clients, are things like having a fear of driving, especially on highways, having a fear of flying, fear of speaking in public, and then often fears related to health anxiety or fears related to relationships. And the bottom line is that we all have fears and we all get nervous and we all feel afraid. It's part of being human. It's, in fact, one of the most common human experiences that we have. And in many cases, fear in and of itself is not a valid reason to not take action, especially if it's holding us back from doing something that we actually want in life. And so most of the fears that tend to cause like our chronic stress or our anxiety can really kind of come down to not managing our own thoughts. And that's really oftentimes what it really comes down to. Um, when we put our thoughts onto things or our attention onto certain things in life, that gives rise to certain kinds of thoughts. So if we put our attention on something that makes us feel really good, like if we put our attention on a loved one, then it'll give rise to certain kind of flavors of thoughts. And then those thoughts that we have bump up against our endocrine system, which causes our body to produce certain chemicals and biochemicals that are released that then cause us to feel certain ways. And so when we are having a lot of thoughts that are fueling our fear or fueling our stress or our anxiety in life, then this whole system, like it creates kind of a vicious cycle. And it's not always a vicious cycle. If we're putting our attention on the kinds of things that really nourish us, then it can become a very positive cycle for us. If we, put our attention on something that gives us, that we feel a lot of love or gratitude for, it's going to give rise to thoughts that then put that sort of heart-shaped feeling in our heart, as opposed to if we focus on everything that we think is going wrong in the world, that's going to give rise to other kinds of thoughts and feelings. So if we're having a lot of chronic stress, if we're having uh, fears that are getting in the way of us doing things that we want to do, one of the things that comes down to is where we're putting our attention and how we're managing our thoughts. And it can be a reflection that maybe we have some more work to do within our own mind. mean, the way that my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, often put it was, making sure that we're watering the seeds that are nourishing to us and that are promoting our inner peace. And um, and when we look at fear, we want to make sure that we're tending to our mind in such a way that, again, that our fears aren't holding us back from doing the things we want to do. And I say this with so much compassion because it's something that I've had a lot of experience with in my own life. There have been times where fears have really kind of dominated in my life. And and I just want to say it's okay for us to be afraid of failure and making mistakes. But in many cases, we're going to need to be able to take action anyway if we want to keep growing and moving forward in our lives. And if you think about it, even when it comes to fears like driving and flying, as humans, we didn't evolve flying in airplanes or driving, you know, 65 miles per hour down the highway if you're doing the speed limit, right? We didn't evolve as humans that way. So it's really not all that surprising that these things bring up our fears. Um, there are a lot of things that our nervous system didn't evolve having to cope with. So we really shouldn't shame ourselves or beat ourselves up for being afraid of certain things in our life. And fear doesn't mean that something's gone wrong. Fear means that you're a human being, you are wired for survival. And up until the very recent past in our human history, you know, you needed fear in order to be able to run away from all of the different things that might be out there trying to eat you, right? So there's always that rule is like, eat lunch, don't become lunch. And so fear does serve us really well in many ways. It, keeps us from doing dumb things like running into traffic or driving too fast, or, I'm sure there are lots of different examples of maybe jumping back if there is a poisonous snake, which that's happened to me before. So that's why that one came to mind. Fear serves us in many different ways. And so we really need to accept that fear is going to be part of our life and to have compassion for ourselves and not shame ourselves for having fears. And even to recognize that we're going to have irrational fears. We can't stop the thoughts that arise in our mind, but we can choose what we're going to put our attention on. And we can we can also have the power to choose new thoughts and to not reinforce those old beliefs or those old fears that maybe aren't serving us so well anymore. And we don't have to be fearless in order to take action. I think I actually even put this on my website because it's something that I feel like I learned this from doing yoga, starting when I was a teenager, was that courage is not a lack of fear, but it's taking action in the face of fear. And being able to take action while we are acknowledging and even allowing our fear can be one of the most powerful things that we can do in our lives. Um, I think that most of the feelings that we experience in life come from the thoughts that we're having. Most of them, most of our feelings, most fear that we feel comes from thoughts that we're thinking. There are some exceptions, but most of them come from the thoughts that we have in our mind. And when we really get right down to it, many of our thoughts are untrue. Some of them are completely irrational. And a lot of them aren't based in what's actually happening in reality in the moment. And so the majority of our fear is coming from something that we're thinking about that isn't actually happening. And it's important that we really let that sink in, or that we investigate to see, is that true for you? A lot of times our fear is being created in our own mind, and sometimes we let it stop us from taking actions that we might want to take or that we might need to take. And the exception is that sometimes our fight or flight response gets activated by a sudden stimulus that completely bypasses the thinking part of the brain. And an example of that could be that if you're walking down the street and a dog suddenly jumps out at you barking, that you can like immediately, just as a bypassing even needing to think about it, that your body just jumps and you're startled and your brain, and it's immediately bumping into that endocrine system again and pushing out that flood of adrenaline so that you could be ready to run or fight if you needed to. And in that case, you don't even have to think about it. It's just an automatic reaction. And that's something we've evolved to do. And it's good for us to be able to react. It's good for us to be able to have that adrenaline pumping through us so that we can get the heck out of there if we need to. Um, so this is, again, like our fear, our anxieties, that those things are built in to help protect us. But that's not the majority of fear that we experience in our lives. We can also create that same sort of chemical reaction in our body and those feelings, um, just like that instinctual one of jumping when we're startled, by focusing on our fearful thoughts or by believing our fearful thoughts or our worries. And fear is helpful. It can get us to move quickly, but it's not so helpful if, we're getting on an airplane and we're thinking about all the things that could go wrong, or we're over and over again in our mind thinking about an upcoming talk or a deadline that we have, and it's giving us that same kind of adrenaline and cortisol reaction over and over again. And that's where the fear itself, uh, and creating more fear within our own mind, does not serve us, right? Because then we're just kind of stewing and marinating in those stress hormones. And if we stay there too long, we know that chronic stress is detrimental to our health. And so what we can do instead is we can start to recognize our thoughts and recognize our fears, and then we can have some compassion for ourselves, right? We can be kind to ourselves and not beat ourselves up, even if we make mistakes, even if we mess up, um, because everything in life has the potential to be a learning experience for us. And so we can have a sense of failure when things don't go the way we planned for, which can really happen a lot in life. At least for me, I feel like that's true, that things often don't go as we planned for them to. Um, I love, I don't even remember where I first heard it, but thinking of fail by using the acronym of first attempt in learning. And I always think that's what fail stands for. It's just your first attempt in learning. Sometimes it's your 10th attempt in learning, but, or your fifth, if we stick with the acronym. But, a lot of times it's like our failures or when we mess up, like that can bring up a lot of fear in us because then we don't trust ourselves. If we think about, have you ever chosen a relationship that just turned out to be really toxic for you, or it went not at all how you planned for it? And then that can lead to, after that, having a lot of fear around opening yourself up to be vulnerable and truly available in a new relationship. So we can see how our fears can hold us back, or how in a way, like our mistakes or our failures can hold us back. And that can stop us from doing the things that we want to do. So we don't want to spend a lot of time in that kind of fear. We don't want to berate ourselves for our failures. We want to look at them and see, what is it that I can take away from that? How can I grow and learn from that experience? And and then we really want to look closely enough at these things that we start to really understand our own thought patterns, and what is it that's causing the fear in us, and can we start to shift those thoughts? Um, and oftentimes, if they're mental patterns that we've had for a long time, they're not just going to change immediately. We can start to shift them, but they can be pretty deeply ingrained, where they're running on autopilot and they're coming up over and over again. And that's where, we have to keep practicing being compassionate with ourselves, recognizing it, choosing new thoughts, and and then working on taking action anyway when it's appropriate to do so. If we take action anyway, then we can see that oftentimes we're actually okay. One of the ways that people are treated with phobias is through exposure therapy, right? If someone has an irrational fear of like spiders or snakes, they'll actually over time expose them. Sometimes, it might start with, focusing on relaxing and just looking at a picture of one, and then noticing the fear that comes up, and can you relax into that fear? This is kind of silly, but not silly. When I was a teenager, a friend of mine came and lived with my mom and I. And then we had never, I don't ever remember ever having any conversations about snakes ever coming up. But one summer, she went home to visit some family in another state. While she was gone, I actually got a pet snake. And then like I talked to her, she got back, and I found out that that was like her worst phobia, that she had this really super intense phobia of snakes, and I had no clue. And it was interesting because, she actually over time, through that exposure, ended up really, in many ways, getting over that phobia. I felt awful though, because I had no idea. And here she was, she comes back and I'm like, look, and I'm so excited because I've got a snake. And she was completely horrified and like had to live in horror. So, um, exposure therapy can be very helpful for us. Like, we can expose ourselves to those things. And that's a funny example, maybe. My friend might not think it's so funny, although now we still laugh about it all these decades later, because it really shifted for her. But, if you think about things like, a lot of people are terrified of public speaking. And for years, I was terrified of public speaking. Oh my gosh. From elementary school through all the way through college, it was like the most mortifying thing for me was to have to talk in front of anybody else. Um, we can be afraid of putting ourselves out in front of others because we're afraid of being judged. We're afraid, whatever our fear around that is, usually it goes to something like being afraid of being judged. But when you really think through the worst of our fears, it's like, what's the worst thing that could happen? And that's something that I do with my own fears, is I'll really like sit down and like write it out. What am I afraid of? Okay, then what? If that happens, then what? To really kind of keep digging deeper and seeing what is behind the things that we fear most in life. And then to kind of keep asking ourselves, what then? Because even the really big stuff, like where we fear our own mortality, It's like, or losing the people that we love the most, and being able to recognize that it's going to happen to all of us, and being able to work through, in a way, accepting those things, again, that we fear the most. Um, a lot of times our fears aren't life or death, don't boil down to life or death situations. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. And again, and most of the time, our fears in many cases are not based in the reality of what's actually happening. It's just our mind jumping to worst case scenarios. And life can be scary. Life is certainly hard at times. And the more mindful we become, the more we can really start to break free from our fears, from our anxieties, the more we can really just be in the moment. And it doesn't mean these things won't still show up for us, but it does mean that they don't have to control us. And I don't want to say, I'm not going to go too much more into this, but I do want to just say that keep in mind that our feelings are simply vibrations in the body that come about as the result of those biochemical reactions of our endocrine system, often responding to the thoughts that we have. And if we think about fear, a scientist might describe fear as a reaction in the body with an increased heart rate, the tensing up of the muscles. For some people, it might be a tingling sensation in the skin. And when we describe it like that, we might think, well, why are we so freaked out by that? I mean, one thing I will often remind myself is that fear feels like excitement and fear energetically feel very similar in the body. It's just the thoughts we have about it that tend to be different. And so sometimes if we're really afraid of something that we know we need to do or we know that we want to do, we can think of it as like, I'm excited. Even if it's like we're afraid to go to the doctor because we don't want to find out X, Y, Z or whatever. And then we can even almost like play that mind thing of, well, I'm just excited to get more information so I know what I need to do next. Um, in many ways, we were programmed to either run or fight or freeze when fear comes up. And so that's our knee-jerk reaction, is to try to avoid it. But when we learn to allow ourselves to feel even the uncomfortable things like fear and to not resist or avoid it, we start to see that there's very little to fear when it comes to fear. Like the fear itself, it's okay. But a lot of times we fear fear. Like we're even like we're afraid. We want to avoid things because we're afraid of the fear and the discomfort that's going to come up with it. So I recommend just practicing maybe being present with yourself and getting curious when you feel a certain thing, of getting curious of, how is that actually showing up in my body? How do I even know that that's what I'm feeling? And then for those things that are uncomfortable, instead of having that knee-jerk reaction of, oh my gosh, I need to do something to distract myself from feeling this awful thing, like I need to go eat something, or I need to scroll on social media, or I need to have a drink so that I can just feel better. Instead, maybe just tell yourself, that's an interesting sensation. I remember when I first started having hot flashes, right? Which thankfully, I mean, it's been really quite sporadic for me. It's only like 1 month where I had them on a regular basis, but the first time it ever happened, I think it like jolted me awake in the middle of the night. And I thought, uh, am I having a hot flash, a heart attack, or a panic attack? Not sure, because it all felt the same. Well, I don't know heart attack because I haven't actually had a heart attack, but but what I imagined it might feel like. And then I remember having a conversation with my mother-in-law, and I said something to her about that and how it triggered like this anxiety in me. And she said, "Oh, when had them, I just thought, that's interesting." So I'm going to give her credit for that one, of just sometimes when we have something that's uncomfortable, instead of, I mean, of course we need to pay attention to something if it's actually serious, right? But having having been being someone who had really severe anxiety and who had multiple trips to hospitals because I thought I was dying, I've learned over the years that I don't need to freak out for every uncomfortable sensation that I have in my body, and that I can actually approach it with, "That's interesting." And sometimes I can then get really curious about, how is that showing up in my body? Or if it's really intense and I need to, then I can just put my attention outside of my body and focus on something else. What's the 5 things I can see or hear or smell or taste in the moment, to give myself a break from that uncomfortable feeling so that it doesn't uh, then spiral into panic. So mm, this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, and we're going to do our practice. And I'm sorry because I didn't mean to talk quite this long. But when you look at people who have created a life that you admire, and you might think that they're fearless, but the truth is nobody is fearless. They're creating their own fear just as often as you are. They're just not using it as a reason to stop and to hold them back from doing what they want to do in life. At least not from what we can see from the outside. So the thing is that, to not allow it to stop us from becoming who we are fully capable of being. Because if I had allowed my fear of talking in front of others to stop me, then I never would have had pretty much any of the careers that I've had in my life. I never would have taught yoga. I never would have shared the things that really transformed my own life. I wouldn't have taught meditation. I wouldn't be here with you all right now. And it's reassuring to me to know that other people have just as much fear as I do, but they're doing it anyway. They're doing the stuff anyway, because that means that I can, and it means you can too. So let's do today's practice. It's not always going to be a long talk before we meditate. Um, so today we're going to use the R.A.I.N technique as a way of uh, transforming, being with our difficult emotions and our fears. And R.A.I.N, another acronym that simply stands for recognize, allow, or accept. So it can be either of those. Investigate, and nourish. And you can use this with any experience. You can make it a standalone meditation practice, and you can also return to it in your daily life. And it's especially helpful when we have difficult emotions and thoughts. So just begin by sitting comfortably and just begin to bring your awareness to your present experience. And I invite you to close your eyes and just begin to notice what you can hear. And now begin to notice what you feel in the body. So noticing any physical sensations, Noticing the parts of your body that are making contact with your chair or the floor or whatever is behind your back. So, noticing whatever you can feel in the body. And now begin to notice what's occurring in your mind. And just noticing the quality of the mind. Are the thoughts coming fast or slow? Are they peaceful or agitated? Just noticing the quality of the mind. And now bringing up a difficult experience or emotion, or perhaps bringing up something that causes you to experience fear. And simply start with recognizing, recognizing those difficult experiences or emotions or things that bring up fear for you. And then recognize the thoughts coming up in relation to the fear or difficult emotion or experience in your life. So, knowing this is a safe space, this is an exercise, we're just bringing up something that causes us to experience difficulty, and noticing the kinds of thoughts that come to the surface in relation to that fear or difficult emotion that you might experience. And notice the sensations also in the body. Do the sensations in the body shift? Is there perhaps a critical inner voice that you often hear? And spend a few minutes just acknowledging the presence of the fear or difficulty, tuning into the different ways it manifests in your experience. So perhaps as you acknowledge the presence of difficulties or fears in your own life, you might become aware that maybe when that happens, it starts to disrupt your sleep, or it makes you want to reach for comfort food, or perhaps you become irritable. So just noticing for yourself and acknowledging the many different ways that your fears and difficulties manifest in your own experience. And now we'll move to the next phase, which is allowance or acceptance. With unpleasant fears and emotions, the habit of the mind is to try to get rid of these experiences. Instead, allow it to be present in you. You might try offering this simple phrase of acceptance. Right now, it's like this. Or, as my teacher often said, we can practice holding our difficult emotions like a loving mother holding her baby, allowing it to be present. Because right now, it's like this. So continue to work with acceptance for just another minute or so, bringing the mind back whenever it starts wanting to push the difficulty away, and just allowing yourself to practice allowance and acceptance for the things that are difficult for you. And now begin investigating more deeply. You recognize what you were feeling in the first step of this R.A.I.N technique of simply bringing to mind the difficulty and recognizing what comes up. And in investigation, allow curiosity to take over. Ask yourself where you feel vulnerable or how this emotion serves you. And if you believe you can be free from this pain. So just allowing yourself to get really curious as you investigate. How does this serve you? Where do you feel vulnerable? And now, for the final few minutes of the practice, I invite you to turn towards nourishing yourself with self compassion. So, this whole practice is essentially a practice of self compassion as you are tending to your pain, to your discomforts with awareness rather than denying it. However, now we're going to make a dedicated effort to offer a few phrases of compassion in order to open the heart. So perhaps you might say to yourself, may I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I be at ease. And may I be courageous in the face of my fears and my challenges. So just offering compassion to yourself, allowing your heart to be tender and open. And now, as this rain meditation comes towards the end, taking time to appreciate and feel what's been generated through this practice. And even if there have been difficult parts of this practice, knowing that the practice has the potential to bring you greater awareness, greater compassion, and acceptance. And when you are ready, letting yourself feel again your physical presence, sensations of your body, your feet, your seat, and upper torso, and neck, and head, and your arms and legs. Beginning to notice the movement of your own breath, bringing nourishment to your body as a whole. And when you are ready, open your eyes. And thank you so much for joining me today.